Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite A-lister food writers. It's about life, culture and politics, all through the prism of food. And this week we're celebrating the poetry and timelessness of the great outdoors.
You know, this idea of stopping for a moment, of slowing down, of getting off the speeding train and just taking a breath. How do we do that? How can we do that?
Outside is Gill Meller's latest cookbook, which takes us to the elemental beauty of his home on the Jurassic coast, just down the road from River Cottage, where he's been a chef and tutor for years. His previous books, Gather, Thyme and Root Stem Leaf Flower, have all captured this little slice of heaven. But as Gill told me, cooking outside doesn't just have to be in the most beautiful place in the world.
It's very much about the joy of actually getting out of the 4 walls of your kitchen and being out under the sun, or, you know, out in the wind, or somewhere where you're immersed in the natural world.
So the concentration on this one is really cooking outside. You know, you and I have done 2 lots of outdoor cooking. You took me down to your amazing beach. There was literally no one there, and you cooked me up a mackerel using very little, and that's the point. And you also did that in the woods for another episode of the Delicious podcast, where we foraged for mushrooms, and you just brought a frying pan out of your back pocket and whacked up some gorgeous mushrooms. I mean, it really is that easy for you, isn't it? Why is it that easy for you and so hard for so many other people?
I don't know if it's difficult for other people. It's just that I find it thoroughly enjoyable, you know, to get outside and cook. I find it slightly more magical than cooking inside, to be honest with you. And that's the sort of crux of the book, is food always tastes so much better outside. And that simple mackerel dish that we ate down on the beach, you know, we could have eaten it round the kitchen table, but by the fire, hearing the sea shore, you know, rolling away, and the smoke, all those elements that surround what you're actually eating, what you're actually cooking, make it stand out. And I think that's the sort of message that I was trying to put across.
It's the magic, and it's the poetry and the ritual of eating amongst the elements. And we were talking just before we started recording about how beautiful I think this book is, and I asked you if you had a novel in you. I want to talk about your writing, Gill. It seems to me to get better and better, and there's a real story in here. And, you know, right in the introduction, it hits you that this is somebody who really has lived in your head outside for a very long time. You moved from the town to the country when you were 8 years old, and you talk about finding a kestrel, and it is the story of Kes. And, well, let me just read a little bit from the introduction. I remember heading out of the door with my backpack stuffed with a flask of soup and some bread. It didn't take me long to reach the steep hillside, a swathe of coarse grass tuffets, hollows and little saplings that all faced south over a bowl of wet fields. I sat down between the grasses to shelter from the late autumn wind, pulled up my hood and watched. Although I was alone, I felt a part of my surroundings, held by them. When I got hungry, I had a cup of hot soup and tore at the bread. Half hidden, I ate, and what I'd eaten, as simple as it was, became a huge part of the moment. In fact, when I look back, it's the soup I remember first. Somehow I can taste it in my mind, and when I do, the valley opens up in front of me. I feel the cold breeze across my face, see the colour of the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a falcon soars. Yeah. It's a moment of journeying, isn't it? Is that what you wanted to do with this book? Did you want to take your reader outside with you?
Yeah, I wanted to really encourage people just to do it, just to get out there, take some ingredients, whether you're preparing a salad and eating it out in the sun, or you're cooking over fire. I think it's just having that little bit of confidence and throwing caution to the wind. So some of those romantic stories that you come across in the book and that you've just read, I was hoping to tease people with that, perhaps, but I also just wanted to sort of pour out some thoughts that I had onto the page. And I remember that that moment, it literally is like it was yesterday, and I'm there. I was there when I was writing it, and I know where that place is, that bank. Now it was saplings. Those trees are, this is 35 years ago. They're huge trees now. I pass it occasionally when I go and see my dad. But yeah, a lot of that stuff and a lot of the bones of this book and my love of outdoor cooking and eating comes from, my childhood and living in the countryside.
And it was bird watching, wasn't it, that really kind of took you deep into the countryside?
Yeah. Well, it was initially, and then I became obsessed with falconry, like the little chap on Kes. And then when I got my own hawk, the first, it was a common buzzard, that I trained, and then after that, every day after school, I was gone. I was just out in the woods, in the fields, with my bird for hours, literally hours, while my mates were all sort of, on their bikes and playing football. I was just on my own, solitary, with this hawk, and it helped me tune into the natural world in a way that seasonal cooking has in more recent years.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic way of just stopping, isn't it? And you really have to, as you say, tune in to the natural world, because you're watching what your bird... I mean, I've never done it, but I...
Yeah, you're right.
I loved that film. I watched Kes as a child, and I was absolutely transformed by it. And what's interesting is what you say about the soup. It's, I talk to a lot of people who go back in time in places through their imagination, but it's always the recipes that then ground them, that lock in that memory. And, when you talk about the soup, for example, it's that elevates that experience and makes it a visceral experience for the rest of us as well.
Yeah. The experience elevates the soup. That was just a very plain, simple soup that perhaps wouldn't be exciting if you were serving it to your friends around the dinner table. But when you ate it in that situation, it was delicious and warming, comforting, and everything you needed on a windy day. So that's what I mean. Things just taste better outside, with all those elements coming into play that surround what you're eating.
Yeah, I remember talking to Carolyn Steele about Epicurus, totally misquoted throughout history. He wasn't somebody who talked about, great big banquets. He talked about that moment of eating something that absolutely sated your hunger, your real hunger in that moment, or a glass of cold water on a hot day. That's the Epicurean experience.
Absolutely.
You talk about soup again in your first food moment. It's the soup that you had when you went for a walk with your wife Alice on a cold wintry Sunday. That was the genesis of the book, wasn't it? Tell us about that soup moment.
So that was, a memorable occasion, but it wasn't meant to be. We were just going for a walk, and I remember it because it was very wintry and cold and blustery, and we went up onto the hill above Charmouth, which is a village just down the coast from where I live, and we walked, and then we sat on the bench and looked out to sea, and it was, it was sort of churning up the sea, and the wind was coming off it. And we were wrapped up in coats and scarves, and we had this thermos of soup. It's a little bit like my moment as a boy. And we just sat there and had this lovely cup of warm soup, but it was just the most delicious thing. And the most sort of grounding, and just sort of, it's like a big hug, right then and there. And it was magic, it's greater than the sum of its parts. Suddenly, something very sort of irrelevant almost, this sustenance, this meal became deeply soothing, and you were very sort of humbled by it in a way, grateful for it. Yes, it meant lots of different things. Funny, isn't it?
It is. You and I have talked a number of times about the link between slowing down, eating from the land, and saving the planet. And it feels to me that this timelessness is your theme, isn't it? It's about, however busy the modern world is, there are these moments of magic that we actually do have to keep coming back to in order to get some sense of perspective and to put down some real rules of life.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you've done that with your kids. You've taken them out all the time. You show them the magic of the everyday, of the mundane.
Well, I hope so. I don't know. I hope I have.
Well, you have, and you write about it.
No, that's true. That's true.
I mean, tell us about that moment in the book where you write about taking your kids out and just stopping and showing them the magic of the little things.
Well, when your kids are a certain age, they see things through sort of magical eyes, sort of tinted fairy eyes. My two daughters, when they were young, we used to take them into the woods. We lived near an abandoned railway track, an old railway track, and it ran through Powerstock Common. And we would venture out, and my memories of it are mostly in the autumn because we would go out picking blackberries and crab apples and things. But they were fascinated by everything that I showed them, and I tried to point out as many interesting things in the hedgerows, in the trees, in the fields. Things that were part of nature, entwined with nature, and just sort of captured their imaginations. Stimulated them in a way that only wild things can, and that I hope had an effect on them, and they made a connection that perhaps they wouldn't have done had I not pushed that, but just I wanted them to be immersed in it.
Yeah, and I think that so many of us do that with our kids.
Of course.
Take them on walks and go blackberry picking, and I think that's what everyone is trying to do. And what I get from your book is that it feels like you're unlocking memories a lot. There's a lot of this visceral way that you describe things, and there's a lot of calling back through, I don't know, the ancestors. There's a sort of a magic that you spin. Your second food moment, for example, the steak on embers. A million years ago, you say, early man didn't use any equipment. And there's this story that keeps going through that is about how it used to be, that outside is still where the magic is. Millions of years ago, people have just been putting their hunk of meat that they've just killed into the fire. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of putting meat directly onto the embers. Why am I thinking that way? And is it okay?
It's a very ancient way of doing things, as are a lot of these cooking techniques. Weirdly, it's if you sort of follow trends, it's become quite popular these days, and you get these sort of chest-beating fire chefs who love throwing pieces of meat into the fire like it's a new thing, but obviously it's one of the oldest ways of cooking, long before there were grills, before there were earthenware crocks and cooking vessels of any type. Early man would have been out hunting. They would have come back, skinned the carcass, and literally hacked off pieces of meat and thrown it into the fire to cook. Yeah. Isn't it strange that we're sort of doing the same thing now, but thinking we're super cool and part of this new movement. But it's a way of cooking that completely turns modern gastronomy on its head, in that you are taking it right back to the beginnings, the very beginnings, and it's being talked about. People are sort of loving it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is how much time it takes, and the way that you talk about just chucking some potatoes in a in some foil and putting them back into the embers and just leaving them, for some time. I mean, tell us about that one.
Yeah, it's an ancient way of cooking, but actually when you think about it, it's quite relevant in some ways to how we do things today. I mean, it's not unusual to wrap potatoes up and pop them in the embers of a fire and let them bake away while you're getting on with something else. That we do, and it's fantastic and it's wonderful. And there's a point in the book where I mention that very thing, and it's a lovely story. This lady told me where she would go out for walks with her entire family. They'd wrap up warm and head off, but before they left, they get a fire going and they wrap their potatoes up and pop them in the embers. And by the time they got back, the potatoes would be cooked, and they'd unwrap them and they'd put lots of butter and cheese on them. And it was just this very beautiful little story about how cooking can make something, so fantastic. So that walk became a sort of journey of excitement because they were going to come back to this delicious reward. It just goes to show that form of simple cooking, outside in a fire perhaps, can be super stimulating and interesting and engaging.
Again, this is a theme of slowing down, and we were talking just before we started recording about my road trip across France and Spain, and I know that you've done that too. In your third food moment is the Campervan stew. When you and Alice were first married, and you just wanted to travel and eat along the way, and that's the outside cooking as well. Tell us about that experience of just eating on the side of the road, cooking where you want.
Oh yeah, well that was a really great trip, but I was young. I was like 21 or something like that, and we bought this old camper van, a Renault Traffic it was, from this old boy in Swanage. I remember it very clearly. And we headed off. We'd saved up a bit of money because I'd been cooking in kitchens, and saved up a bit of money, and off we went. And I think it was 3 months. We went down through France and Spain and round to Italy. But we didn't have a big budget, so cooking was something we thought about. It was considered. We didn't have loads of cash to splash on expensive ingredients, and we certainly didn't go out to eat that regularly. So it was all about finding good, fresh, locally grown seasonal ingredients and cooking them in a fairly simple way. And that Campervan stew that I mention in the book, and give a recipe of sorts, I must add, because it varied every time, was it sort of encapsulated the whole trip in that it was a way of cooking, quite often outside over a little campfire or inside on the little burner in the galley in the van. It was a way of cooking that just sort of relied on some fresh courgettes and peppers and beans that we picked up, and maybe some tins of tomatoes that we had knocking about, fresh parsley and olives and things that were relatively easy to get hold of, cheap and seasonal. And the reason I put it in there is because it switched on a light in my head about what simple good cooking can be, and doing that outside in all these different locations along the way made it that more special. So it was good. I was glad I wedged that recipe in there.
Absolutely. And the other one that you wedged in there is our mushrooms that you foraged in that wonderful wood next to your house. And I was so touched at that. It was such a lovely moment, because you say that after we did that recording for the Delicious podcast, the woods have now been returned to what's happened to them? That
particular woodland is managed by the Forestry Commission, and they, time had come that they were felling a lot of those trees for timber, So where we were walking and in areas that surround that, it's been literally levelled, which was very actually traumatic when we next went up there, and it was all change. But those conditions that the mushrooms that we picked, the hedgehog mushrooms, grow in had changed beyond recognition, so they won't grow in the same way. So it was quite a moment in that sense. So it went in the book for that reason, but not wholly. It went in because that moment that we spent together and cooked in a very stripped back way, little fire, pan, some fresh ingredients that we'd happened to pick, those collectively made up a very sort of special moment for me, and a memorable one. It's funny how food can, they just carve these memories into your mind. A good cookbook, I think, needs that. It needs genuine experiences and moments, and the things that you've eaten that really knock you back and just blow your mind. If you can get them into the book, if you can convey how special it was, then I think that comes through to the reader, and maybe it comes through to the food that they make.
It absolutely does. It's all about a good cookbook, I think, is when you take your reader by the hand and you take them into your world, and you do that really beautifully. Your final food moment is about the soggy sausage Saturday. Now, this is a piece of writing. Honestly, Gill, if you don't get loads of awards next year, just simply for this piece. So this is you on your fantastic Jurassic beach with kids and dogs and families and friends and everything that everybody wants out of their Saturday afternoon.
Well, I don't want people to think like that. But we're very lucky that we've got this beach, and
it is pretty idyllic. And then what happens? So can you just read us a little bit of this?
Yeah, so this is the introduction to the feasting chapter, and we did have this feast down on the beach a few years ago. And as you say, there was lots of kids, and it was set to be a fantastic lunch, but it all sort of changed. And this is a little section from that intro. I can't remember whether it was September or October, but I'll never forget looking out across the water while we ate and seeing the clouds on the skyline. They seemed to pull together into a wall of black matter that began to barrel its way south across the surface of the ocean. The squall sucked the light out of the sky and absorbed sound from the air. As we all turned to stare, it felt like time had come to an end. The silence lasted for a couple of seconds, then imploded like a fading star, and then it just exploded dramatically into a fierce, seething maelstrom. The sea was drawn up under the darkness and raged like wraiths on black horses. The land bowed under the weight of the clouds. Then it began to rain. It came in hard like stair rods before the wind, as if the torrents themselves were fleeing the fury of the screaming gale.
Beautiful. I mean, I was there. I don't care about being absolutely soaked to the skin in this. It is exactly what outside is all about. It is elemental. And, the beginning of that section, you talk about lost kings and tribesmen and people of the tundra.
Yeah.
To go back in a circular way to where we started, it is about conjuring up your ancestors. There's this sense of timelessness and this wonderful slowing down and really appreciating, loving the outside, the elements of it all. But it's about the celebration of the elements. I was thinking about how how I tend to be around a fire. We tend to be quiet around a fire, and that felt very noisy and outsidey and, elemental.
Yeah.
I wonder if now you know, when you light a fire or a fire pit or whatever it is, people sit around it and they become contemplative and meditative, as if we've lost something. There's a yearning that fire invokes in people, and I wonder if it's something to do with all that magic that's gone out of our lives.
Well, we have sort of lost that connection. I think there's something very primal and special about sitting around a fire, whether you're cooking or not. You know, it draws us in. It's a way of coming together. You know, very much like we would around a table. You know, our early ancestors would come together around a fire, and that is magic. And you know, this idea of stopping for a moment, of slowing down, of getting off the speeding train, and just taking a breath. How do we do that? How can we do that? In the book, I try and suggest that getting outside, getting a fire going, cooking something simple to eat over it is one way of doing it. You know, it's a way of switching off from our mad modern day lifestyles, getting away from the laptops and the phones and just engaging in something completely primal and very real. And I think we all need that, you know, more and more as the world seems to spin faster and faster, just to get off at that junction for a moment. Just step off this speeding train, slow down, get outside, whether it's a picnic on the beach or just a summery lunch in the garden. It's so important to stop and breathe.
Thanks for listening. You can read the transcripts to the show at gillysmith.com. Just click on podcasts. Please do get in touch on social media. I'm at Cooking the Books with Gilly Smith on Instagram, where you can follow my adventures in cookery with Leiths Online. You can check the show notes and on Instagram for full details of how to get those Cooking the Books discounts on Leith's cookery courses. And I'll see you next week when we're cooking outside again, this time in London, as Helen Grays introduces us to some of her neighbours cooking over wildfire.